afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yamina Lazic, the Associate Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And on behalf of the Center, it is my great pleasure today to welcome and introduce Joshua Yaffa, who has written prolifically and incisively about Russia and about the war in Ukraine that we will be hearing about today. He's a contributing writer for The New Yorker and is also author of the award-winning Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia, which won the Orwell Prize in 2021. Additionally, he's written for Foreign Affairs, The New York Times, National Geographic, and a number of other publications. And he is currently the inaugural writer-in-residence at Bard College Berlin and was previously a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. So please join me in welcoming Joshua Yaffa.
Thanks for the warm and generous introduction for everyone coming today. I'm indeed going to talk about my life and reporting in Moscow, where I spent just about exactly a decade, and my time in and out of Ukraine, where I've traveled extensively, certainly in the last 3 years during the war, but in fact going back for many years before that. The war began for me like it did for so many millions of people across Ukraine. I was in the city of Kramatorsk in the east, in the Donbass, and woke up at 5 in the morning to the sound of explosions as cruise missiles hit a air base and military headquarters in town. I ran to the basement, looked at my phone, saw, like so many people in Ukraine, Russia, across the world, Putin announcing the start of the so-called special military operation, and understood, although I couldn't imagine the particulars, it was clear that a new era had begun for me personally, as a writer, but also just as someone living in Russia, but certainly in the history, modern history of the two countries. I spent the next 2 days driving across nearly all of Ukraine, or east central Ukraine, arriving to Kiev on the third day of the war, which was an eerie, ghostly shell of the city I had remembered from previous visits. I managed to beg my way into a room in one of the few hotels that was still open, and went to the supermarket to stock up on salami, nuts, and apples. The city at the time was surrounded by surrounded on three sides by Russian armored columns, and word was that a siege was imminent any day or even hour. It was a scary and uncertain time, but I have to say that the actual act of journalism in those days felt relatively easy, especially in hindsight. Everything was interesting, important, and urgent, and felt like it was imbued with the kind of stakes that meant the story wrote itself. All you had to do those days was to go outside, report what you saw and heard, and it felt like every experience you had was worth publishing. And every single person in the city those days was in the middle of an utterly extraordinary experience, in some ways myself perhaps included. Over those first days and weeks, I heard and saw the war, but in the form of explosions in the distance, flashes of fire and light in the sky, and sometimes came across its after effects, like visiting the site of a firefight on Kiev's western edge near the zoo. They were certainly haunting scenes, but felt more eerie than gruesome. War felt like an abstraction or even absurdity, hard to believe that it was all really happening. I remember the moment about a week or two into the invasion when I was confronted with its more concrete reality. I visited Akhmedou Children's Hospital in the center of Kiev, where in the courtyard I came across a pediatric surgeon named Roman Zhizhera, who took me to the room, or the ward, where a 7-year-old boy named Patient Unknown Number 1 was hooked up to a ventilator. Zhizhera told me about how the boy was riding in a car with his parents and 2 sisters when they came under fire. Shells exploded all around the car, ripping through metal and then flesh. His parents and sister died and one sister died on the spot. The other was taken to another hospital. Patient Unknown Number 1 was taken to Akhmedou, where he underwent emergency surgery. Later, doctors managed to locate his grandmother and at least understand or learn his name, Simeon. I asked Jejera about Simeon's condition. Not good. Shrapnel had passed through his neck. He was on life support. Quote, "As a doctor, I understand what happened to this child," Jejera told me. "But I don't understand what is going on around us, here and across the country. Something absurd and terrible is happening." Several days later, I came back to the hospital, where I again found Jejera in the courtyard. He looked, on the one hand, energized by the urgency of his work, but his eyes were tired and glassy. I asked him how Simeon was doing. He said the boy had died the day before. Soon, the scale of violence, in Simeon's case, very individual and concrete, mounted to something harder to fathom. The destruction, for example, of Mariupol, the deaths of tens of thousands of there, was an immeasurable tragedy, and one that repeated time and again, especially in towns across the east, places that I visited 1 week or month, only to have them nearly leveled the next, their populations evacuated or dead. Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, and the list goes on. To many Ukrainians I met and spoke to in those days, the war had an immediate and undeniable existential quality. To surrender would be to be killed, either as individuals or as a nation. Massacres in places like Bucha, stories of occupation in Kherson and elsewhere, felt like it drove that point home all the further. This history, the following history, has been already hotly debated, and I'm sure will be for many years, but that spring, as negotiations between Ukraine and Russia fell apart, it seemed to me, in Ukraine at the time, and also now with the hindsight of recent history, that on the one hand, that was due to the revelation of atrocities in places like Bucha, which soured already fragile Ukrainian public sentiment on the matter of dealing with or engaging with the Russian state in any negotiations, and at the same time, the very reason we know about Bucha is because Russian forces were forced to withdraw from the Kiev region. They didn't manage to sack the capital, kill Zelensky, and so on. This was their initial plan, and that early military success allowed many Ukrainians, both in the public and in government, to think that maybe they wouldn't have to negotiate at all, but rather could achieve victory on the battlefield. That summer, the first major tranche of Western arms began to pour into Ukraine. That fall, in a surprise counteroffensive, Ukraine managed to liberate more territory, about 1,000 square miles, that had been occupied by Russia since the start of the war. This furthered the idea that perhaps Ukraine could defeat Russia, as I said, on the battlefield. Many inside Ukraine allowed themselves that thought. Many Western officials, including the US, also wondered aloud if that might be the outcome of this war, given Russia's poor performance militarily, even if those Western officials did not provide weapons at the scale or speed that Ukraine requested, a theme that would arise time and again and really come to color relations between Kiev and Washington and other NATO capitals. I want to pause there for a moment and return to a place, Russia, where, as I mentioned, I lived for just about exactly 10 years, from February 2012 to February 2022, a period bookmarked by political change, or at least the possibility of political change. In February 2012, I arrived in the middle of the so-called Bolotnaya protest, at the time the largest, and in fact to date, the largest anti-Putin, anti-Kremlin protest in Russia's modern history, and left in February 2022, or rather left before the war began, in early February, and in fact never returned from that reporting trip that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so, what do we make, or what can we make or think about Russia and Russians' response to the war? I'm sure many in this room are familiar with opinion polls, especially those in the first days and weeks of the war, that suggest 70 or 80% public support. But what does that really mean, especially in a climate of wartime censorship? I would argue that more than anything, the data reflect an impulse born out of both or either fear and passivity, to repeat approved messages rather than articulate your own. I'll be naming a number of Russian colleagues, sociologists, political philosophers, and so on, whose work and analysis I've come to rely on as I myself find am out of Russia for some years. And the first I'll quote from is Denis Volkov, who's the director of the Levada Center, an institution I'm sure many of you know, Russia's premier, really lone, independent polling and research center. And he told me in the first days of the war a similar idea that surveys don't show what people think, but what they are ready to say, how they are prepared to carry themselves in public. In those early days, Volkov relayed what I thought was a very interesting story about a focus group he had carried out in a provincial Russian city. A woman there told him that she supported the quote, or the so-called special military operation, but told Volkov that if she got her information from other sources, say the BBC Russian service, as he mentioned in particular, she might think otherwise. The woman told Volkov, quote, "If I watched different channels, I would probably have a different opinion, but that's why I don't watch them." So it's not that this woman doesn't know alternative information is out there, but rather doesn't want it, lest her vision not only of the war, but rather of the entire world in which she lives and exists, come under threat. Volkov told me, quote, "It's not about having to reconsider this one event, but everything you thought and understood over the last 10 or 15 years. I found that story, why I'm telling it now, quite remarkable, a case of essentially saying the quiet part out loud, but also offering a prism into the subconscious of, I would believe, many millions of Russians. From the outset, more than 2 decades ago, the Putin system was based on the idea of a disengaged public with matters of civic and political concern left to those on high. In other words, a demobilized society rather than a mobilized one. And so in that context, it appeared not merely ineffectual, unlikely to lead to any result or change, but actually irrational to participate in collective action. After all, if such efforts were more likely to end with you getting hit in the head with a police baton or sent to jail for several years, rather than actual change, what indeed would be the point? And this arrangement suited both state and citizens just fine. In that decade, I lived in Moscow, returned to the US, spoke to audiences like this one. I often got the question, so what do Russians think of Putin really? Just like, in fact, in recent years, totally understandably, correctly, I often get the question, so what do Russians think of the war really? The thing is, Russian public doesn't really, or doesn't so much approve or disapprove of government policies as much as it tries to exist apart from them. The role of the individual, I would argue, is not to try and affect the state's behavior, but rather to try and protect against its consequences. So instead of actively resisting, most Russians, and this applies to the period before the war, those who opposed Putin, even in their own minds, sense of politics, morality, sought first and foremost to disassociate themselves from his rule, even on an emotional or psychological level, and this condition was dubbed internal emigration, which suggests the degree to which people remained in body but not in spirit under the auspices or in the shadow of the Putin system. This dynamic not only held true, but I would say became more acutely relevant with the onset of war. After an initial state of shock, fear, and discomfort, many people tried their best simply not to think about it at all, at least not in the big, sweeping terms that us in this room might expect from ourselves or from them. Another Russian expert who I've come to rely on, read, speak to oftenly is Greg Yudin, a sociologist and political philosopher, now at Stanford, or excuse me, we're at Stanford, at Princeton, among other affiliations. And he, in numerous conversations, characterized to me this attitude as understandable, or at least unavoidable, given how deeply many people in Russia have internalized their own political powerlessness. Yudin used the following metaphor, which I liked, quote, "If you notice that it started to rain outside, it would be silly to sit around and create a plan to how to stop the rain. Better to figure out how not to get wet." In that first year, Yudin came up with a taxonomy of categories, social categories inside Russia that I also thought was helpful. He dubbed these categories radicals, dissenters, and laymen, that is, fanatics who enthusiastically support the war, critics who strongly oppose it, and the majority, in his estimation at the time, 60% or more, who try and avoid the subject and take no position. Throughout the war, the Kremlin has offered just enough rousing pro-war content to keep the radicals engaged, but also gives the laymen and women an opportunity to look the other way and carry on with their lives as before. There was a moment of rare candor, I believe last year, when Valery Fyodorov, the head of the usually loyal state-run polling agency, admitted, really lamented, that the so-called party of war, the term he used, those who genuinely support the war and its aims, represent only 10 to 15% of society. And this is someone whose entire career is based around giving the Kremlin the numbers it wants to see. Fyodorov said, quote, "The majority of Russians do not demand to take Kiev or Odessa. They don't enjoy the fighting. If it were up to them, they would not have started the special military operation, but since the situation has already developed this way, then we must win." This attitude, and here I think Fyodorov is saying something quite accurate or true, in fact, is not quite opposition to the war, and we shouldn't understand it as such, but we also shouldn't understand it as enthusiasm or support for the war. A brief but important shock to this dynamic came in September 2022 when Putin announced partial mobilization, that is, a military draft. The Levada Center registered the biggest drop in public mood, measured with things like the share of Russians saying they felt stress, anger, or fear, in a single month since the Russian default, in financial default and resulting crisis in 1998, when the economy cratered and millions of Russians' life savings were wiped out. Yet interestingly, mobilization proved less of a rupture of the status quo than a continuation of it. The initial active phase of the draft, when men were called up in large numbers, police and military combed the streets, workplaces, and elsewhere looking for draftees, was over in a month or two. Russians who hadn't been mobilized or didn't see their immediate family members called up were able to return to their habitual state of disengagement. At least for the moment, it felt like most men and their families had dodged a bullet, in some senses literally. Polling data done by the Levada Center calmed, and as I said, the status quo ante returned. In my writing on Russia, speaking on it like I'm doing here today, I try my best to avoid essentializing or otherizing Russia. I don't particularly believe in the concept of a quote-unquote Russian soul, and there's no reason to think that I or any or all of us in this room would react or behave all that different if we were dropped into the reality and context of contemporary Russia. It's a rather universal feeling, for example, rather than a particularly Russian one, that when your country is at war, even if you don't like or understand that war, the thought of defeat can be paralyzing. Another bit of research I'd like to share with you comes from a very valuable and important group called the Public Sociology Laboratory, run by a number of Russian researchers and sociologists, many of them now in exile, which has tracked public attitudes inside Russia since the start of the war. I've spoken at length numerous times over the past years to Svetlana Erpulayeva, one of the group's coordinators. She's now based at the University of Bremen in Germany. And one of the overarching points that Svetlana has made to me over this time is that it would be incorrect, as we've already talked about today, to label those who condone, excuse, or otherwise accept the war as supporters. Svetlana talking to me, quote, "These are people, the majority, who weren't used to having political positions before the war and didn't form one as a result of it. They don't condone violence or killing. In fact, these subjects make them uncomfortable. But over time, they look around, television, signals from the state, relatives, colleagues, and convince themselves, alternatively, that war is necessary, unavoidable or somehow happened on its own, a tragedy without an author and therefore a responsible party. One report prepared by the Public Sociology Laboratory followed the evolution of a number of respondents who they had spoken to over time. These are educated professional Russians from unnamed big cities who were initially troubled by the invasion. That was the group that they chose, people who in the first weeks and months found themselves uncomfortable or even opposed to the invasion. A Russian IT specialist said, quote, "I believed that we were making a terrible mistake, that we were evil." A year later, researchers spoke to him again. He said, quote, "Now I see the war as something inevitable and very painful, a very difficult decision, but an inevitable one." He spoke of Russia's war as just the latest in a long line of human conflict. Quote, "It turns out that there is always war somewhere. It always exists in one place or another on the planet." Another respondee was a female business owner who said that initially she tried more than anything to avoid news from Ukraine. Quote, "If I had the opportunity to somehow influence the situation, if something depended on me, of course I would do everything to stop it. But tying yourself in knots, watching everything, discussing with everyone, I don't want to do that either. What's the point? My duty is very simple: take care of myself, my family, and my close circle." A year later, researchers spoke to her again. Her views by that point had hardened. Quote, "I get the feeling that my country is being unfairly bullied. Now I am even more patriotic than ever." I spoke not long ago to Volkov, the director of Levada Center, who told me about another focus group that the group had carried out, a much more recent one, with a very interesting participant, a woman who had taken part in protests in 2019 against a planned landfill in the country's north. This fairly would be, or was at the time, something you could squarely call opposition activism. The police were called in to quash those protests. People were arrested. But now, she told Volkov, she has written off those who currently protest the war as being, quote, bought off by the West. And in fact reconsiders her own involvement as also something naive. The Kremlin's strategy, Volkov said, of framing the world as split between us and them does indeed meet or create success, as he relayed in the context of this woman, but many others, those who at one point opposed the Putin system, if not even in action, then at least in mind, have ended up now choosing the Russian side in the war. I think that many of those in this room who retain contacts with relatives, colleagues, friends in Russia over the past several years might have seen this dynamic play out, perhaps at smaller, more subtle scale, but the phenomenon of deeply anti-Putin, anti-war Russians, but who have chafed as they have faced all manner of bureaucratic, financial, and legal difficulties as they try and navigate life in the West, has in fact, if not led to support for Putin in the war, at least led people to become skeptical, if not hostile, to Western arguments and interpretations of that war. Switching back to Ukraine, where, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've traveled many times. Last month, I took another reporting trip to Ukraine. I think it was my 8th or 9th since the war began. I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone in this room to talk of a mounting sense of exhaustion and loss in the country. Obviously, the quick victory that I talked about some minutes ago did not materialize, and now it's not clear if a victory of any type will ever materialize, at least not the unambiguous battlefield one that was being considered or hoped for in the early months or first year of the war. For all of its many inefficiencies, the Russian military draft that I mentioned has managed to shore up defensive lines, meaning that for 2 years now it's been effectively impossible for Ukraine to mount the kind of rapid and effective counteroffensive that it did in September of 2022. Russia has managed to reorient its economy around the war effort. This year, the state will spend around 8% of GDP on military and national security. That's more than double the percentage of GDP that the United States spent on military matters during the years of the Iraq War. And so that bonanza of state spending inside Russia has created a massive redistribution of resources that in fact has only strengthened Putin's base of support among poorer and more peripheral quarters of society. These groups have benefited not just from higher wages in the industrial sector, but from other populist measures like increased subsidies and other payments to families. Friends and acquaintances of mine who have stayed in Moscow and who work in seemingly unrelated industries, construction, legal services, tell me with some guilt, but also satisfaction, making more money than they've ever seen in their entire lives. Meanwhile, for other categories of society in Russia, sign-up bonuses of up to tens of thousands of dollars, now 50,000 or more in Moscow for joining the army. That's really unheard of, genuinely life-changing money for many Russian provincial regions. It means that even without an active or large-scale draft, Russia manages to pull in tens of thousands of new recruits every month. Those bonuses have risen in recent months, a sign that interest or readiness to join the military is waning, but compared to Ukraine's mobilization, more on that in a minute, Russia is able to pull in more than the necessary number of foot soldiers to essentially sustain the war effort indefinitely. And so as a result, in Ukraine, Russian forces continue to push forward largely in the Donbass at great cost to their own forces, but still with a feeling that Russia enjoys an objective advantage in both men and material. And as I said, there's little feeling that somehow Ukraine will manage to dramatically or miraculously turn the tide of the war and recapture large swaths of territory that have been occupied for now approaching 3 years. When I was in Ukraine last month, visiting UN Commission estimated that power outages this winter could reach as much as 18 hours a day. But at the same time, negotiations that might end the war, or at least this active phase of fighting, look effectively impossible. Ukrainians, for their part, are convinced that such negotiations would simply allow Putin time and freedom to regroup and rearm and reinvade Ukraine yet again, this time keeping in mind the mistakes he made the first time. And so what's left is a kind of repeating doom loop with nearly static front lines, with men dying in trenches merely for each side to largely stay fixed in place. In other words, not my original idea formulation, but an update of World War I, except with killer drones. On this recent trip, I saw a good friend of mine, Tanya, who I've come to know quite well over the past 3 years, and she told me this idea of how, as she put it, death is, quote, 1 or 2 handshakes away. We discussed an attack the year before by Iranian-produced Shahed drones, a weapon that Russia uses or sends in swarms to attack Kiev. In this case, it was the drone swarm was sent to attack a thermal power plant near the main train station. Instead, the drones, or at least one of the drones, overshot, slamming into an apartment building across the street. Among those who were home were Victoria and Bogdan Zamchenko in their mid-30s. Victoria was several months pregnant with their first child. They were both killed instantly in the blast. Victoria Vika, she was known, happened to be a mutual acquaintance of mine, friend really, of Tanya's. I instantly recognized her face when the news of her death began making the rounds. She worked as a sommelier at Good Wine, a gourmet emporium in the center of Kiev with an in-house bakery and a coffee bar, a regular stop on all my visits to the city going back to the years before the war, a place of refuge and pleasure, not like any of, or many of the cafes and wine bars within a few miles of this auditorium. I had met several soldiers, or interviewed several soldiers who had later died in battle, but Vika's death felt different. She was an eminently familiar and recognizable peer, a young woman who worked in a wine shop who once helped me pick out a suitable Pinot Noir for dinner at a friend's house. And within some months of Tanya and I having this conversation about Vika, Tanya's cousin, who enlisted in the army in the early months of the war, was himself killed in battle in the south. Given that in Ukraine, so many of the country's most promising, energetic, and patriotic young people were among the first to volunteer to fight, their names have since been overrepresented among the dead. Another colleague and friend of mine, Natalia Gumenyuk, a noted Ukrainian journalist, commented how, quote, "This war is consuming the best of our people." She said that on the occasion of the death of Roman Tushny, a prominent and very well widely loved 24-year-old activist who was killed on the front. There are too many depressing, awful, irredeemably tragic aspects of this war to counter or relay here, and I won't. I try to avoid, in my writing and speaking, waxing too philosophical on the meaning of it all. I hope to avoid, certainly in my writing, a kind of brawny, Hemingway-esque romanticization of fighting and dying. Over the past 3 years, I've come to see or believe that war, more than anything, looks like sitting somewhere in the mud, cold and miserable, trying not to be killed by a piece of flying metal that you'll never see. The aforementioned widespread use of drones has completely changed the experience of war, making the very act of being above ground exceedingly dangerous, if not suicidal. And so war in Ukraine these days means, or rather fighting the war, means simply or essentially sitting in a dugout or a bunker below ground for as long as possible. The logic of this war is, as long as your guys are the ones huddled below ground, then that land is yours. And among the most deadly operations in this entire war is simply getting in and out of position in that bunker. On this last trip to Kiev that I mentioned, I interviewed President Zelensky, who at the time was preparing to head to the US. He struck me in our conversation as impassioned, even aggrieved, convinced that Ukraine was making sacrifices in its fight against Russia so as to save the West from having to make its own. Zelensky told me, quote, "The American public should realize that the fact that Ukraine is still standing is not the problem. I believe we have shielded America from total war." That is, he meant what would happen if Russia had managed to run roughshod over Ukraine and extend its dominance deeper into Europe. Zelensky again, quote, "That approach would broadcast to the world the following implicit rule: I came, I conquered, now this is mine. It will apply everywhere: land claims, mineral rights, borders between nations. It would imply that whoever asserts control over territory, not the rightful owner, but whoever came in a month or a week ago with a machine gun in hand is the one who's in charge. We'll end up in a world where might is right. It will be a completely different world, a global showdown." The problem, as I've alluded to, is that no party in the conflict, Russia, Ukraine, its Western backers, are incentivized to take dramatic steps to get out of the current status quo, even as costly as it is for all sides. Putin will not stop until he achieves a pacified, loyal Ukraine. Ukraine will not stop until it feels it has guaranteed its security in a durable, long-term fashion. And the West neither wants to abandon Ukraine fully, nor provide it with the arms or security backing, say, NATO membership, that it believes would risk provoking escalation by Russia. So what sort of future, then, does that suggest? Here I couldn't do any better than predicting the likely course of events and quoting one of my favorite books of late Soviet history, perhaps a favorite of some in this room, Alexei Yurchak's "Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More." And that strikes me as a pithy summation of Russia's current condition. What looks durable and immutable could equally likely collapse tomorrow. Most importantly, I believe the Putin system rests not on his popularity, but rather on the lack of mechanisms people have to act on the malaise, discontent, and frustration that they do feel. In the past 2 decades, the Kremlin has quite successfully managed to dismantle those instruments. There's no longer an independent media to hold the state account. There are no credible opposition parties that can channel dissatisfaction into real politics, and there's no judicial system capable of holding the state to account. And so if feelings of resistance, discontent have no credible outlet, then the feelings themselves are repressed. Here I'd like to quote Greg Yudin again, who told me about his own experience talking on these subjects to audiences in the West. Audiences often ask him, Yudin relayed, so if people aren't happy, then there should be crowds in the streets. But he asked, rhetorically, but what are those crowds going to do? Among the last times Yudin and I spoke, it was just after the death and funeral of Alexei Navalny, Russia's most prominent opposition leader, and we discussed the unexpectedly large number of people who came out impromptu, unplanned, in what you might call grassroots way for the funeral of Navalny, and kept appearing at his gravesite in the days later to bring a mountain of flowers. Yudin said, quote, of course, in a country of 140 million, there are plenty of brave people, but that was never the problem. The more relevant point is that it's entirely unclear what to do with this bravery, where to direct it, and for what end. Remember what I said earlier, it's not only in Russia where people tend to neither be foolish or suicidal. The future of the Putin system then, I would argue, depends on the appearance, or rather the continued absence, of instruments or avenues to challenge it in a meaningful way. Yudin again, quote, it's not that you change your attitude and then take action. If you see an opportunity for action, then you might rethink your attitude. As for Ukraine, the strain of war is showing more acutely, rather obvious considering that Ukraine is the country under attack and on whose territory the war has been waged for 3 years. Mobilization, that is the task of bringing in the necessary number of troops to sustain the war, is an issue of increasing controversy and debate inside Ukraine itself. By now, all of those who wanted to volunteer have long since done so. Many of them are injured or dead. And the way the Ukrainian state currently brings in or drafts new recruits is rife with inefficiencies, injustices, even cases of corruption, and a society that felt in the early days or first year of the war unified and with a shared sense of mission, purpose, and sacrifice now feels under the pressure of polarization and unequal burden. That's not to say Ukrainians are close to capitulation, far from it, but it does mean the government faces political pressures that simply don't exist in Russia, at least not in the same way. I believe, or it seems to me, that territory is actually the easy question. It would be painful politically and psychologically for Ukraine to part with up to 20% of its land that is currently occupied. But even if it never formally agrees to recognize that or give it a kind of legal imprimatur. But polling does suggest an uptick in those willing to consider such concessions. Zelensky himself, notably in our interview elsewhere, no longer speaks of the maximalist aims of returning Ukraine to its 1991 borders, Ukrainian sovereignty over Crimea, and so on, but rather a, quote, just peace, a politically squishy and flexible formulation that offers plenty of room for maneuver. And so if Putin's war aims were merely about control over, say, the Donbass, I think a deal could actually be in sight. The problem is that we should take Putin at his word, at least in terms of how he talks about the war, what drives the war, his thinking behind the invasion and the continued prosecution of the war in its third year. He has spoken of Ukraine as a, quote, anti-Russia, a territory on Russia's borders and in Russia's historical dominion that was lured into the West's security orbit and steadily turned into a staging ground for opposing and undermining, negating really, everything that Putin-era Russia stands for. And this for Putin looks to be an intolerable existential danger. We could call this a paranoid fantasy, and we'd be right, except that for him this vision seems to be genuinely guiding his thinking. And so he doesn't really care so much where the borders of Ukraine lie. If Kiev is nash, that is ours, subservient to our interests, then it doesn't matter who controls Odessa or Dnipro, maybe even the Donbass. But if Ukraine continues to be this anti-Russia, that is civilizationally and geopolitically opposed to Russia as Putin defines it, then it must be destroyed, block by block, city by city, life by life, until Ukraine and its Western backers finally come to their senses. So that brings us back to the dead end. A deal attractive on paper in which Ukraine agrees to give up territory in exchange for, say, NATO membership or equivalent guarantees is intolerable for Putin, and a deal without those guarantees would be impossible for Ukrainians to accept. And so we're left with this doom loop, as I mentioned. War with this repeating, looping quality, which presents its own struggle for a writer. I've written over these last 3 years on the heroic and in many ways unexpected defense mounted by Ukrainians, the war crimes and atrocities carried out by Russian forces, the fraught and uneasy moment that actually comes after a particular town or village is liberated. Readers are familiar with all these stories and themes and don't necessarily want the second, let alone fifth or 12th version of them. And the truth is that maybe I'm not as compelled, at least not in the same way, to write them. I don't have a solution to this paradox. As I found in Ukraine, as tragedy mounts, it repeats, and repetition is a hard thing to ultimately to overcome in what ultimately is the news business. And so war, in all of its corrosive side effects, is becoming the new normal in both Russia and Ukraine, as I've tried to lay out here today. Death, suffering, wasted time, opportunities and lives, that is simply now the context in which people exist and navigate life. Maslow's hierarchy works in reverse, as what was once a rich and expansive life is reduced to a matter of survival, whether literal or economic, professional, psychological. Return to my friend Tanya, who I mentioned earlier. She's 36, with a background in marketing, but also with interests in photography, dance, and wine. On my last trip to Kiev, I had dinner with her and her parents. Tanya told me at that dinner, quote, "It's the stolen time that pisses me off most. All the things I could have done, the life I could have lived. Instead," she said, "the last years have been defined by one idea, a single necessity, survival." Literal, she meant, but even more applicable to her life, psychological, economic, personal. An extraordinary situation, or what was an extraordinary situation, becomes an ordinary one. That might be the next theme worth tackling for me as a writer, but for better or worse, I feel I'll have plenty of time to do so. Thanks for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
So we have time for questions now.
I have a question.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. I am following in Deutsche Welle and France 24 and everywhere Ukraine situation. And my question is, I am more interested to know how really people in Ukraine feel about U.S. policy reaction when in private they talk with each other. Because I see that many Ukrainians here and also on TV that they thank U.S. But I am wondering for the help that U.S. sent, but at the same time I realize that they should be very disappointed over ineffectiveness and slowness and all the wrong policy. How do they react? Because I, as an Iranian, I know that Iranians don't say, but they feel that they are betrayed by
I understand the question, and the answer is that all of those emotions and more that you mentioned. What's also true and genuine is a feeling of gratitude, or at least an understanding that without the U.S., this war would have been over in a matter of days or months, and that it was the U.S. aid that allowed Ukraine to really have a chance to fight this war, defend its country for 3 years, and to put it in the position that it's in, which is, even if it's not a particularly advantageous or hopeful moment for Ukraine. The fact that it got there at all is in large measure to military support from the US. And that's something that Ukrainians acknowledge, not just in public, but in private. But at the same time, there is a great deal of frustration. Too little, too late is the best way to summarize it, in that why is it that when Ukrainians, or the Ukrainian government, military, makes a request for a particular type of weaponry, first the answer is no, 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 and then 6 months later, a year later, it's yes, but already when the moment in the war has passed when that particular type of weapon system would have been most useful or have a biggest impact on the battlefield. And so this feeling of delay is very frustrating. This feeling that every time Ukraine has to make its case all over again, right? That it has to kind of prove why its own defense matters to the US. It has to make all the same arguments again, whether to officials in the White House, Pentagon, Congress, public. It feels like this argument should have been made once, accepted, and then the West and the US most of all should have kind of bought into wholeheartedly, or in a kind of whole-scale way, coming to Ukraine's defense. I'm not necessarily saying that, I'm not weighing in and saying that would have necessarily been the better course of US policy, but it certainly is what many Ukrainians feel. And then there's a feeling now, in the context of the upcoming presidential election, which Ukrainians are following very, very closely and aware of the huge stakes of that election for Ukraine, but that Harris would be effectively a continuation of the Biden status quo, more or less, most likely. And that status quo, while it provides for Ukraine's defense, as we've talked about, also doesn't really provide for Ukraine's ultimate victory. It's just enough support to keep Ukraine from losing, but not really enough that would allow Ukraine to gain the upper hand in the war. And instead, Ukraine is on this path to sort of losing slowly, kind of being bled out over time. And of course, that's a very discouraging and frustrating situation for Ukrainians to be facing. And so there's even actually, in some quarters, you get a question, a kind of rhetorical question aloud, like maybe even Trump would be better for us because it would, in some unpredictable way, scramble the chessboard, or kind of scramble the pieces on the board. And, maybe it could be much worse for us, but maybe it could be much better because the path we're on seems to be this path toward kind of a slow de facto loss with the loss of many lives in the process.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm Margarita Shishevgida, and I'm a visiting fellow at CSAC here. You know obviously a lot about Russia, about Ukraine, and about Europe. And this war is not about Ukraine and Russia. It's about Europe. It's about the future of Europe. It's about the future of global order. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned about the forthcoming elections in the US, that Ukrainians are sort of even probably waiting for some game changer, so their eyes are on Trump as maybe potentially more favorable candidate for Ukraine. But if you, that's probably a general opinion, but if you look at the expert community, if you look at the other European countries, we dread this potential scenario if there might be some game changer which would give a lot of power to Putin. So what is your feeling? I know it's not a crystal ball and it's very difficult to give any forecast. What could be a potential resolution of conflict if Trump comes to power and if Trump becomes president of the United States of America? Thank you.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I didn't mean to suggest that the majority of Ukrainians I speak to favor a Trump presidency. No, most would still be very wary of that outcome and would probably, if it was up to them, favor Biden. It's merely that there's a bit of wondering aloud that perhaps, that we know what we're getting with Harris, a continuation of the Biden administration's policy, and Trump might be really, really bad for us, but maybe it could be really, really good for us. We just don't know. It's more of an unknown, and maybe it's worth taking a gamble on the unknown, while still being more afraid of that outcome than not. If it were to happen, I don't know, maybe we should take Trump for his word, like like I suggest to do in many ways with Putin, in that Trump has said, he'll try and end the war quickly. He'll try to do it in grand fashion, out of a sense of kind of self-aggrandizement, that he's the only one who can bring this war to a close, and so he'll try and force both sides to an agreement quickly. Ukraine, of course, is very wary of that, because the only way to get Putin to agree to something quickly, right? I mean, the advantage right now is on Russia's side militarily, right? So what could convince Russia that it has more to be gained from stopping the fighting than continuing it? Well, you'd have to offer Putin something quite attractive, not just territory, this kind of de facto or de jure allowing Russia to continue to occupy this territory, but ensuring that Ukraine remains kind of neutral out of NATO, out of these Western security structures. And he might go for that, but the problem is that I don't see how Ukrainians would. I think, as I've mentioned in my talk, I actually think there's a readiness that hasn't quite been vocalized fully on the territory question in Ukraine, but it would have to be paired with a feeling. The main priority now in Ukraine is, this is my impressionistic or kind of anecdotal sense more than something I have data on, is that how do we end this war so that there isn't a next war? What can we achieve? We're ready to compromise on territory, especially these territories that have been occupied not just for 3 years, but for 10 years, like fine. That's unrealistic to get those back, but how do we make sure that when this war ends, we're not just resetting the clock for the start of a new war? And on that, I don't know how realistic, could there be a credible offer that the West could bring to Ukraine that would also be palatable to Putin? I'm not so sure, and that's why I get to this feeling, as I mentioned in the talk, of not really seeing where the overlap, where a realistic outcome could be. But if Trump, to answer your question specifically, decides that he wants to have peace at any cost because he stuck his reputation to it, or he affinity for Putin, whatever, then a dramatic cutoff of U.S. military aid would force a different calculation in Kiev about both the scale of what they were ready to agree to and also the time frame for doing so.
So thank you so much for the talk. So I want to link this for the ladies here. So what can you speak to what this war means to nuclear proliferation in general? Because my understanding of the history is that there was an agreement or memorandum that Clinton signed with Ukraine that they would give up nuclear weapons in exchange of some guarantees. That didn't happen. So right now we have Iran about to get to nuclear weapons. So if I were Iran, I would make the test to be left alone. And how can you speak how this war, the way it's going, will impact negatively, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, a very interesting data point, a way of answering your question is that Zelensky himself the other day, just within the last week or so, said that either there's a kind of peace deal palatable to Ukraine, either its security is guaranteed in the ways I've talked about, either membership in NATO or some functional equivalent to that where it can feel reliably certain that Russia cannot invade again, or Ukraine will restart its nuclear weapons program. That came as a shock to a lot of people. That kind of came out of left field. Not who were expecting Zelensky to say that. I'm not sure he really means it in the sense. I don't know. Here I'm not an expert. I don't know if Ukraine currently has the kind of technical military means to build nuclear weapons. I doubt it, but it did certainly have that expertise some decades ago. And as you mentioned, it gave up its nuclear weapons, so it's not out of the question. But I don't think the timescale would be so short or fast. But the mere fact that Zelensky was raising the question, I think, I'm not an expert on non-proliferation per se, but has to be rather ominous that that he's now thinking or speaking in those terms. You either provide me with these security guarantees, or I make my own security guarantees. And what sort of security guarantees does he have in mind? It's the nuclear question. And so I would think whether it's the precedent you mentioned of Ukraine giving up its weapons, a case of a country that decides to voluntarily non-proliferate and is then invaded by its neighbor is probably not very good for non-proliferation, nor is a country saying the only alternative to security guarantees from NATO is to restart that nuclear weapons program. I'd say both probably are not great for the cause of non-proliferation.
Maybe it's too recent, but I was wondering if you had seen any change in probably still in a, what you call a doom loop, but any change in public sentiment that you've seen, or policies you've seen?
Not in a durable way. I wouldn't be able to quote the data specifically, but remarkably in Russia, that's been somehow absorbed and internalized and kind of turned into a non-event, both politically in terms of Putin barely talks about it. I mean, I don't know how many square miles of Russian territory is under foreign occupation. Anyway, that hasn't happened since World War II, right? Like pretty dramatic turn of events. But Putin doesn't talk about it, doesn't seem so bothered about it. And the Russian public actually also doesn't really care for reasons that all the reasons I talked about over the past hour, right? That's just not, unless you happen to live in Kursk Oblast, it's not really anything that has to do with your life, and so dissociate all the dynamics that I've talked about. So it doesn't seem to be inflicting a real political cost on Putin. Interestingly, when I spoke to Zelensky, this came up, and one of the reasons he gave for why Ukraine launched that operation was to try and essentially put a sort of dent in the mystique of the Putin state as being somehow omnipotent, and that would kind of show Russians that the state actually was weak and could not defend them. That was not the only reason Zelensky gave for launching that operation, but it doesn't seem like that has really led to meaningful change. And in Ukraine, maybe the change was more palpable, if short-lived, because it was already faded by the time I was there, which is 3 weeks ago, and I think I would posit even more faded today. But it did give Ukrainians a feeling that they're not just playing defense. They're not just this idea of like kind of slowly losing over time, but it's just a matter of when the trajectory is only negative for them. Going on the offense did buoy spirits inside the country and give a dose of enthusiasm or energy for continuing the war, because people saw it really might actually have an unexpected dynamism to it rather than this trajectory of merely kind of steadily losing. But frankly, the news or the picture on the rest of the front has been so dire for the past weeks that I don't really see Kursk still having much of an effect inside Ukraine at that time.
So actually kind of related to that, I was curious if there were, what your impression of your reactions were, both on the Ukrainian and Russian side of the Wagner rebellion, if that had any lasting impact, or, similar to Kursk, it was just kind of flashing in.
On the Ukrainian side, I feel like that was more met with almost kind of snacking on popcorn amusement of like, let's see what kind of insane trouble the Russians can get themselves into. And Prigozhin was a figure of sort of fascination and delight on the Ukrainian side for that reason, as the kind of bull in the china shop phenomenon. And of course, yeah, the infighting between Wagner, the military, all of that was something that Ukrainians gobbled up as great entertainment, but also having real disorganization within the Russian war apparatus was certainly good for Ukraine. On the Russian side, it's similar like with Kursk, that it's just not an event that registered. It was like a televised, it was a day of televised drama, basically, or not even fully on television, telegram, social media, elsewhere, but most Russians did not feel, here there is data to back this up, Levada Center, others have done polling on this, it came and went without Russians really having much attachment to either party, and that's, I would argue ultimately that's actually bad news for Putin in the sense that nobody, look around in society, there's an armed mutiny against Putin, and no one cares, no one comes to his defense. This is not 1991, there are no demonstrators in the street to protest against the coup. No one cares. Like, Prigozhin could have made it all the way to Moscow, and people would have shrugged the same way they shrugged when he stopped halfway. And so he neither had great, sizable, there was a constituency of Russians who were sympathetic to Prigozhin, but he never was going to lead a mass rebellion against Putin. But I think more significantly and worryingly in the long term for Putin, nor did we see, when push comes to shove, was there any actual mass movement in support or defense of Putin. And the next time, if there's a more effective, brave, smart, whatever, Prigozhin, it's clear no one, even not just in the public at large, like in the security apparatus, like we didn't even see in the very institutions that are meant to mobilize and defend the Putin state a whole lot of eager mobilization to do so.
You described very well the difficulty of opposing Putin inside Russia without organization. But you also said at the end of your talk, or towards the end of your talk, that you saw a possibility of sudden collapse of the regime. Could you speculate a little bit more about what factors could cause a sudden collapse? And extending that, could you say a bit about what you think, what you see, speculation again, of course, what happens after Putin?
Sure. I don't want to disappoint, but I don't really have a concrete scenario in mind when I talk about concrete sudden collapse. Putin dies, for example. That's an easy one, right? Or somehow less likely given the realities we've been discussing tonight, but Russia suffers a sharp, acute, undeniable military defeat inside Ukraine. The Russian army is decimated, left in tatters, destroyed. Also would be a very dramatic event that could lead to a quick political change. But there's also dozens, hundreds of others that I would be unable to name. But the point is, and this goes back to what I just said about the Wagner mutiny or whatever we're calling it in the response to it, but also Yudin's point that I highlighted, which is attitudes could change very quickly if opportunity changed. Right, and the attitudes in a way are latent. They're there. Frustration, discontent, disappointment, wariness, exhaustion with the Putin system. It's all there. It's just, I would argue, this is maybe me extending the point made by Yudin. It's just waiting to be activated, or those sentiments are just waiting to be activated by a change in context, by a change in this opportunity matrix that Yudin is talking about, and that suddenly, if it appeared, if the option or the potential for real change, or for an individual or collective to actually to be able to affect real change, if that were to appear, then the attitudes could appear to go along with that opportunity instantaneously. They're there. They're sort of waiting to be activated. And so I don't know what the scenario could be. It could be multitude, but because the support for the Putin system, or rather, it's not support. It's this kind of tolerance based off of a dynamic of inability to do anything about it. If that inability were turned into ability, then I think the sentiment could change very quickly. As to what would come after that, it also depends on the circumstances of change. Is it did Putin die suddenly or slowly? Did he die as the result of a kind of palace coup? Did someone knife him, or did he, I don't know, have an aneurysm? Each of those, I think, produces a different set of, not necessarily outcomes, but possibilities. And a lot depends also on the cunning and decisiveness of the various groups inside the ruling system that have no love lost between them for many years, are rivals for resources, power, influence, and will certainly be waging their own battles to try and gain the upper hand in the wake of Putin's departure or the collapse of that system, were it to ever happen. But we've never really seen these groups tested in that kind of open, in a condition of open conflict. That conflict has always been mitigated by Putin himself, who's the ultimate arbiter of that system. So we don't actually know which of these groups will be more skilled, brave, decisive in imparting their will in the post-Putin future.
We have time for, do you have a question?
Sure, yeah. I want to ask what you see as kind of the future of Russia's democratic movement and civil society in kind of short of that, like, broad society.
Here I'm, to my own sadness and frustration, quite pessimistic. I don't really see much, even, I don't want to sound too dismissive to say I don't even see much to describe there, but I'm not even really sure what we're discussing, whether it's a kind of attempts at organized political opposition outside the country, which to my eye, I don't know what you think, don't seem to have much relevance or impact, certainly not on politics inside Russia. And I'm not sure we're seeing the appearance of a kind of government in exile, government in waiting that would be credibly able to take over on day one in the event of this, for a post-Putin future to arise. And nor do I see, I have friends, colleagues, people I respect immensely who work for Russian independent media outlets now based abroad, but I'm also not sure there how much those groups are really affecting or driving developments inside Russia. And so I think we're left with a situation, I would argue, this is just me talking here, but with kind of frozen politics. The last caveat being, of course, that can all change. That could change by the time we leave this room, right? It's like, it's not frozen because people themselves are content with the status quo or have no, what I'm now calling today, like latent feelings about it. They're there. That could change very quickly, but at the moment they're on deep freeze. But as we've discussed, the thaw could happen quickly.
Okay, final question.
I also want to ask you to speculate, but I want you to speculate about the reaction of Ukrainians. Suppose Putin gets his wish and takes over substantial parts of Ukraine. Are the Ukrainian general population going to be more like your picture of the Russian population, which agrees with my experiences from 1993 to 2008 when I was there off and on, which is the government and the state should just kind of, how do I avoid them? Don't bother me, what do I need to do to keep them? Have the Ukrainians become more, do they see themselves as the state is serving them?
Well, I would say, to my eye, that political cultures in Ukraine and Russia have diverged dramatically over the past 20 or 30 years, and by this point, especially actually through the crucible and trauma of the war, they've become even more divergent. And this notion of thinking of yourself as not trying to affect matters of state, but simply trying to avoid or protect against its consequences. Of course, I mean, that exists everywhere. That exists in the United States too. It's not some exclusively Russian phenomenon. It's a matter of degree. But no, Ukraine has a very different history. To apply this Yudin idea of you have thoughts based off of the opportunities to realize those thoughts, right? You judge how likely am I to be able to impart real action. Based on that, I will then retroactively decide what my opinions, thoughts, ideas are. Well, Ukrainians have seen over successive decades that their actions matter and that there is opportunity for action. And here I'm just speaking objectively. It's not a qualitative assessment. It's just 2 revolutions, 5, 6 presidents. I don't remember in post-Soviet Ukraine compared to 2. That's easy to remember in Russia. So Ukrainians, according to this kind of Yudin matrix, let's say, right, which I think works not just in Russia, Ukraine, maybe universally, it has some explanatory power. While Ukrainians have been conditioned or trained or learned to see that their actions do matter and they are able to impart real change, and so therefore that affects their political attitudes, the way they think about themselves, the way they think about certainly themselves in relations to the state. They're much more demanding. I'm speaking in broad generalizations here, of course, but think of themselves as political subjects in the sense of people who actually are driving events, not merely the kind of on the receiving end of events. So I think the political cultures are very different, but on the question or the way you phrased it about territory and Russia's continued hold over territory, I spoke on that already in a few different ways, but there I think Ukrainians are willing to effectively give up territory even if they wouldn't be comfortable with that exact phrasing. You have to be clever about the way you put it, but de facto giving up on territory I don't think is something many Ukrainians would go for, not because they see themselves as somehow disassociated from matters of politics, but rather as a political choice they would make as a country together in the cause of peace and ending the war if they were able to get the other kinds of guarantees that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking